Hi everyone, today we're going to be going over the Mesozoic era. So to start, I just want to review kind of what we already covered. We talked in the last two videos about the Precambrian and the Paleozoic respectively, and now we're going to move on to the Mesozoic. So down here on this timescale, we can see from right to left, going older to younger, we have the Precambrian, which includes the Hadean, Archean, and Proterozoic. And then we have the Paleozoic, which is the tiny green band. And then we have the Mesozoic. And this is what we're going to talk about today. And the main event that I put on here for the Mesozoic says dinosaurs, because that's pretty much what everybody thinks about when they think about the Mesozoic, because it includes the Jurassic period. But it's a lot more than dinosaurs. And so even if you only know about the Mesozoic because of the dinosaurs, today you're going to learn a lot more about the events that occurred in the Mesozoic. First, I'm going to go over geologic events that occurred in the Mesozoic. So tectonic settings and paleogeography, which just means how the continents shifted around. And then I'm going to go over the life portion, so the biological evolution and what kind of life was living during the Mesozoic, including but not limited to dinosaurs. So first, for paleogeography, we can see in this figure that in the Permian we left off with Pangea. Pangea was a supercontinent that formed in the late Paleozoic era, so the Permian period. And this was around 250 million years ago, right when the Permian was ending. And it left the supercontinent to break up during the Mesozoic. And this is what occurred. So we can see from 250 million years ago to 200 million years ago during the Triassic, we had this shift in continents where Pangea broke up into Laurasia and Gondwanaland. These two continental masses continually break up into smaller continents throughout the Jurassic around 145 million years ago to the Cretaceous around 65 million years ago, the latest Cretaceous. And we can see by the end of the Cretaceous that the continents are starting to split up enough to become almost recognizable as how they look today. So that's kind of how the continents were shifting during the Mesozoic. But what was going on the surface of those continents? Specifically, we talk about North American mobile belts in the last video, in the Paleozoic. We named three specific mobile belts: the Cordilleran, the Ouachita, and the Appalachian mobile belts. In this video, I'm going to be focusing on the Cordilleran mobile belt, and that is because the Cordilleran Orogeny, or mountain building event, had three stages occurring in the Mesozoic, and we're going to go over these stages because this video is about the Mesozoic. However, if you want to hear more about the Ouachita and Appalachian mountain building events, you can watch the Paleozoic era video. So to get started for the Cordilleran Orogeny, what we had is three main events. The first, occurring in the late Jurassic, was the Nevadan Orogeny. I'm not going to go through all the nuances of the differences in the stages in terms of what was occurring in subduction. The main thing that I want you to notice is that these are ocean continent subduction zones, because this is the western margin of North America, which today has a lot of accreted terrain because of these subduction zones. But also throughout these different stages of the Cordilleran Orogeny, I want you to see how the angle of subduction flattens. It's pretty cool that the deformation that's caused by subduction changes a lot depending on angle of subduction. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, you'll see in the next couple orogenies how that slab that is subducting is going to flatten as it subducts. So first, in the Nevadan orogeny, we do have kind of a steep angle of subduction. Then as we move on, we have a little bit flatter angle of subduction in the Sevier orogeny, which occurred in the Cretaceous era. And we can see the deformation extends eastward because of the flatter angle of subduction. And then we have the flattest angle of subduction during the Laramide. The Laramide orogeny occurred in the latest Cretaceous to the Eocene. And these stages are basically separated by the angle of subduction, as we can see clearly now with the Laramide. It's way flatter and the deformation is way more eastward. So now that we know the three stages of Cordilleran orogeny, when they occurred, and how far westward versus eastward the deformation they caused was, let's now take a look at how the continents were looking during the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous on a globe. So if we start with the Triassic era, or around 250 to 199 million years ago, we have this continental configuration where we have Laurasia and Gondwanaland after Pangea began to break up. And what I'm going to be pointing out in each one of these globes is the epeiric sea that had transgressed onto North America during that time. And epeiric seas are just seas that are on continents. And so as we can see during the Triassic, there was the Absaroka Sea, and we'll see this kind of evolve into different seas throughout the Mesozoic. However, I just want to point out that the reason that these seas are important is because these are where a lot of deposition occurs. And so when there's deposition in those epeiric seas, then it will leave behind signatures in its rocks that we can go find later on the continent and go figure out the environment of that epeiric sea, and therefore a lot about what was going on during that time period. Now let's look and see the evolution of the epeiric seas on North America throughout the Mesozoic. During the Jurassic, right after the Triassic, from 199 to 145 million years ago, we have Laurasia breaking apart more into the continents like we saw in the first figure that we looked at for the continental shifting. Then Gondwanaland also continuing to change its configuration right before it's about to break up more. And then we have, instead of the Absaroka Sea, we have the Zuni Sea. And then we also had, by the mid to late Jurassic, what was called the Sundance Sea, which isn't really shown here, but it caused shallow marine shale and limestone to deposit in Montana, Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado during the mid-Jurassic. And then by the late Jurassic, muds and sands were deposited along tidal flats, alluvial fans, and rivers throughout western North America, forming the famous Morrison Formation, which has tons and tons of dinosaur fossils in it and is famous for that. It also has a lot of mammal, plant, fish, amphibian, and insect fossils as well. So it's not only dinosaurs, but that's what it's famous for. And finally, by the Cretaceous, around 145 to 65 million years ago, we have the Cretaceous interior seaway that formed, and this was a huge seaway going across North America. And what was cool about Cretaceous deposition is that during this period, there were a lot of microscopic organisms that built their shells or body skeletons with calcium carbonate, and they were so microscopic and abundant that when they died and contributed to limestone formation, they formed such fine-grained limestone that it was called chalk. And I'm sure you've heard of chalk. And it's really cool that this was all because of tiny organisms. And actually, during the Cretaceous, you can kind of remember that this was the period in which chalk became abundant because chalk is in its name. Creta in Cretaceous is actually Latin for chalk. So that's just another indication of how much chalk was deposited during this time. And that in itself is an indication of how much of these microorganisms evolved during this time. So now let's do a quick summary of the main events that we just discussed in the Mesozoic era in terms of tectonic settings and epeiric seas. So what I have here is a timeline going from older to younger, right to left, and it is just showing the Mesozoic, so the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods. And in terms of the events, I have all of the epeiric seas listed here in the green boxes. We have the Absaroka Sea in the Triassic, the Zuni and Sundance seas in the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous interior seaway in the Cretaceous. In terms of geologic setting events, we have the Sonoma Orogeny. So we talked about the Sonoma Orogeny in the Paleozoic video, but I just have it here for reference to remember that it was an orogeny that was one of the earlier stages of the Cordilleran mobile belt development, and it occurred in the latest Paleozoic. However, moving into the Mesozoic, we have the rifting of Pangea and formation of Gondwanaland in Laurasia. The continents continue to break apart during the Jurassic. The Nevadan orogeny, the first stage of the Cordilleran orogeny that is fully in the Mesozoic, and then the second stage of the Cordilleran orogeny, the Sevier orogeny, and then the Laramide orogeny, the third stage, which continued way into the Cenozoic. So remember that it's not only in the Mesozoic. We just talk about it here because it began in the late Mesozoic. So there's the paleogeographic summary in the Mesozoic. So now let's move on to Mesozoic life. What I love about this picture is it kind of has something of everything during the Mesozoic. We have invertebrates, which we'll talk about first. We have vertebrates and we have plants. And starting with the invertebrates, what we have that is dominant in the Mesozoic for marine invertebrates is mollusks, scleractinian corals, echinoids, coccolithophores, which are those microscopic calcareous organisms I mentioned that form chalk. Then we have the dominant terrestrial invertebrates, such as insects like flies, butterflies, moths, wasps, and termites. There are actually termite mounds found in some Mesozoic red beds. But let's start by going over the super dominant phylum that we just listed. This was the mollusks. During the Mesozoic, it was called the Age of Mollusks because of how dominant these were during the Mesozoic. And we're going to talk about four main groups of mollusks that were really important during the Mesozoic. These include ammonites or ammonites, shown here. Then we have the belemnoids or belemnites shown here, then bivalves, then gastropods. So let's start with the ammonites. These are just a group of cephalopods that were really dominant and abundant during the Jurassic to Cretaceous, but that's the only time range that they lived in. So they have a really short time range, and this made them incredibly amazing index fossils. Not only did they have a short time range, they were also geographically widespread and abundant, and they even had really distinctive morphologies depending on when during that time range you were looking at. And you can see here that some of these morphologies included really different sizes. For example, we have really small in the upper right corner. We have these earrings made up of an ammonite fossil. Then we have really large. These things got huge sometimes, and you can see this in the bottom right picture. This is a huge ammonite fossil. And in addition to that, they also had distinctive suture patterns. And what suture patterns are these squiggly lines here at the bottom picture in the center. We have these patterns in one of their layers of their shell formation, and we can look at these when they're preserved in the fossils, and we can see kind of when throughout time this guy lived, because the suture patterns really distinctively got more complex throughout the fossil record of ammonites. Moving on to belemnoids or belemnites, these were also cephalopods. They were a little bit different than the ammonites. They're kind of squid-like in shape and structure, and what they had though was this internal calcareous shell, which is what got preserved. And so that's this thing in the upper right corner that is preserved here. It's this dark calcareous internal shell, and then their entire structure is shown in the picture just below that, and that is kind of showing all their other physiological parts that weren't always preserved because a lot of those parts were soft, but the hard inner shells were what most often became preserved. And these guys also only lived during the Jurassic to Cretaceous, so also a really small time range, and therefore these were a really good index fossil. Here's another picture of their just crazy abundance in one single rock. I mean, these guys were everywhere, so it's kind of cool. Moving on to bivalves, there were both burrowing and swimming bivalves by the Mesozoic, and this made them better able to survive than epifaunal brachiopods. Epifaunal just means sitting on the seafloor and living that way. Epifaunal groups of brachiopods couldn't burrow into the sediment, and they couldn't really swim away from any predators or anything. And so they were a little bit more susceptible to being eaten. And so burrowing and swimming were really good adaptations for these bivalves. And in the Mesozoic, something interesting occurred. The dominant bivalves were actually asymmetrical bivalves. In the fossil preservation video, we talk about how bivalves are typically symmetrical along the intersection between their two valves or shells. However, in the Mesozoic, there were a lot of asymmetrical bivalves, meaning their two valves or two shells were really differently shaped, and one was way larger than the other. Examples of this are in rudists. At the top right here, we have example drawings of rudists on the left, and then a drawing of a rugose coral on the right. This rugose coral has nothing to do with these rudists, and it even lived in a way different time period. However, I show it because it shows how cool the convergent evolution was between these lineages, meaning rugose corals had evolved to fill some sort of ecological niche, and then after they went extinct, rudists, which are mollusks, which aren't even in the Cnidarian phylum, also evolved to fill a similar niche. And we can see this by their morphology, and also by the fact that they were major reef builders during the Mesozoic. They actually built reefs, and I'll show you a picture of a rudist reef in the fossil record in a second. But basically, these were really abundant and really dominant during this time, these rudists, and they are an example of convergent evolution. And then we also have here at the bottom some examples of other asymmetrical bivalves that were really dominant, including Exogyra on the left side and Gryphia or Dryphia on the bottom right. And these shells look like they're just showing one side, but they actually have a little tiny cap shell or valve on the bottom sides of them, or in the case of the right picture on the top. And then the entire rest of it is the other valve in both cases. And so one valve is just way bigger than the other. And that was really common during this time, like I said, asymmetrical bivalves. And so now we'll move on, but first I'll show you the picture of the rudist reefs. This is just insane to me. me. I mean, it's just crazy how much we're around in the one spot and how much they dominated. But this is a late Mesozoic rudist reef. Now, moving on to gastropods. Gastropods are just snails that are still around today. They have quite extensive time range, so they're not quite as useful as index fossils as all the other three groups that we just showed. However, they were also very dominant during the Mesozoic, and this is why we're going to go over them. So basically, snails were both aquatic and terrestrial, and both burrowers and epifaunal gastropods existed in the Mesozoic. Also, some of the epifaunal groups had evolved spines and thicker shells because they needed to protect themselves because they couldn't burrow, and they ranged from being herbivores, carnivores, and scavengers. So now let's move on to vertebrates. This is what we've all been waiting for, dinosaurs, right? So I'm going to kind of go over how dinosaurs evolved from what we left off in the Paleozoic with. We left off with some dominant tetrapods, including anapsids, diapsids, and synapsids. In terms of dinosaur evolution, we're going to start with the diapsids, because those evolved to become archosaurs. Archosaurs are a group of tetrapods that evolved two main groups by the mid-Triassic. These groups were the crocodilian group and the S-shaped necked group, and dinosaurs descended from the S-shaped necked group. And you can probably guess what descended from the crocodilian group, crocodiles and other reptiles similar to that. And in terms of dinosaurs, two main orders of dinosaurs existed by the late Triassic, and these included the ornithischians and saurischians. These basically only differed in their pelvic bones, and ornithischians included dinosaurs like Stegosaurus and Ankylosaurus, and these were quadrupedal, not bipedal, so that's another difference, and that's also because of their pelvic bones. They were large, and they were slow-moving. And saurischians included dinosaurs like the T-Rex and velociraptors, and these were much faster-moving, and they were mostly bipedal, and they had feathers. And before we move on, I just wanted to mention that researchers have found 80-million-year-old feathers preserved in amber, and I just thought that was really cool. I mean, how else do you get a perfectly preserved feather? I mean, you can get impressions, but this is just, amber is the best. And now moving on to birds and mammals. Basically, the first true birds evolved by the Jurassic around 150 million years ago is thought to be the oldest bird, or Archaeopteryx, and here's a picture of him. However, it's really hard to nail down when birds evolved the first true bird, and this is mainly because birds seem to have evolved from many different groups, so convergent evolution again. And this is probably because flying is a really, really helpful trait to have. Moving to mammals, we have mammals that evolved from synapsids. If you remember the three groups of tetrapods, synapsids were the ones that went on to evolve mammals. And we talked about one specific group of synapsids, the cynodonts, which we talked about surviving that really crazy Permian extinction, which is great because they went on to evolve into mammals, which we are. So we're grateful for these cynodonts. And true mammals were thought to have evolved by the late Triassic. And groups of mammals that were present during this time include things like rodents, marsupials, and platypuses. And a couple examples of these rodent-like and marsupial-like groups include Multituberculotes, I think that's how you say it, on the top right here, and Repenomamus on the lower right. And this mammal actually ate juvenile dinosaurs, which sounds kind of crazy. You'd think it'd be the other way around, but yeah, he's pretty ambitious. And by the Cenozoic, which we'll talk about in the next video, the mammals began to diversify because the split of the continents allowed more geographical isolation and therefore more speciation to occur. And they began to dominate because the dinosaurs weren't around to eat them anymore. But we'll talk about that next time in the Cenozoic video. So moving on to marine vertebrates during the Mesozoic, we have marine reptiles, which include plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs, and mosasaurs, going from older to younger in time. And there's a lot more, but I'm pointing out these groups specifically because I'm going to show you a picture of these, and I want you to think about, if you want to pause, you can pause, and think about what these kind of resemble in today's ocean. Because when we think about marine reptiles, what's common in the ocean today are things like sea turtles and sea snakes. But these don't really look like sea turtles and sea snakes. These look a little bit more like the mammals that we have in the ocean today. So dolphins and other porpoises and whatnot. However, these aren't mammals mammals at all. So it's really cool, the convergent evolution going on to fill the ecological niche that the mammals weren't around to fill yet. Or rather, that these reptiles filled an ecological niche back then, and then when they went extinct, later in the Cenozoic, mammals evolved to fill that niche. Even though they were already on land, they evolved to go back into the ocean to fill the niche that these reptiles once filled. It's really cool to see how different lineages that have no relation to one another can fill the same niche in totally different times in Earth's history. And lastly, let's talk about Mesozoic plants. This is the last thing we'll go over. Basically, all I want to point out is a couple main points here. Gymnosperms we talked about evolving in the early Paleozoic in the last video over the Paleozoic era. However, one main type of gymnosperm went extinct by the Jurassic, and another main type, the cycads, thrived, which led to the name Age of Cycads for the Jurassic period. And then the other thing that evolved that was really important for plant diversity was angiosperms, which became abundant by the Middle Cretaceous in the last period of the Mesozoic. And these were flowering plants, which also contributed a lot to insect evolution and diversity. So these were really important. And so now I just want to recap the paleontological events that occurred in the Mesozoic. Most of these I just went over, some of these I didn't go over, but just for your reference, you can know what occurred when. So first we had the first dinosaurs in the Triassic, then the scleractinian corals or modern corals evolved in the Triassic as well, and then the first mammals, and then the in-Triassic extinction, which I can't really talk about today because I don't have time, but there was an extinction at the end of the Triassic period. Then we had the first ammonites and belemnites, and then Archaeopteryx, or the first true bird, at around 150 million years ago in the late Triassic. And then rudist reefs dominate in the Cretaceous period. And then we have the first angiosperms or flowering plants in the Cretaceous, and then the first pollinating insects, which kind of goes along with that. And then the KT extinction. This was the Cretaceous Tertiary Extinction. Don't ask me why they put a K instead of a C. I have no idea, but it's the KT extinction event. So this extinction event is marked here by the green star on this diversity graph and the dip in biodiversity that we have here. And 75% of all species on Earth are thought to have gone extinct during this extinction. And even though that's much less than the Permian extinction, it's still a very important mass extinction that is probably the most famous one because the dinosaurs went extinct. However, in terms of causes, you all probably know about the meteorite impact, but there were also other things. But first, let's talk about the meteorite. In terms of this impact, it wasn't that it hit and it killed everything. It was more that it caused a lot of climatic conditions that were not good and killed a lot of things indirectly because of the climate change that it caused. So one of the main things it caused was a cloud of dust that enveloped Earth for over a year, or it's thought to have been over a year, and it blocked sunlight, preventing photosynthesis, and obviously that would cause a lot of death. And then something that made this boundary really recognizable because of the meteorite impact was a really consistent layer of iridium that occurred in Mesozoic rocks at the very end of the Cretaceous, marking this boundary in this extinction event. And it marks the meteorite impact because iridium is typically found in metallic meteorites. And in addition to this huge cloud of dust and climate changes that the meteorite caused, there was also volcanic activity that likely contributed a lot to this extinction event. This volcanic activity was in the Deakin and Siberian traps, which I'll show you the location of in the next slide. But basically, this volcanic activity contributed ash to the sky, which also darkened the sky, blocking more sunlight and preventing more photosynthesis. And carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide emissions were also a result of the volcanic activity that would have caused global warming, acid rain, ocean acidification, and more. And that's just a recipe for disaster. And the last possible cause or contributing cause is major regressions. Warm, shallow seas that had transgressed onto the continents during the Cretaceous started to regress during the late Cretaceous while all these other climate changes were going on. And that caused a lot of loss of habitat and additional climate change to stack on to what else was going on in the environment. And this all just changed the environment drastically, and the animals that were living then couldn't really keep up, and many of them went extinct. Now, these are just some pictures of the Chicxulub crater, which was the crater formed by the meteorite that had impacted, which is located in the Gulf of Mexico. Then we have a couple pictures of the location of the Deakin and Siberian traps, and these were the volcanic fields that contributed a lot to the extinction during this time. And with that, that is pretty much all I have for you guys. I hope this video was helpful, and I hope you enjoy this lovely picture of a dinosaur with feathers, and I hope that you learned about the geologic and paleontological geological events that occurred during the Mesozoic. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.